Good Tuesday to you, everybody. Incom 715. Welcome to week boom 4. How's everybody doing? How's your week gone? Mine has been a little bumpy. I came down with a pretty serious case of bronchitis. Very unusual for me, although I'm an asthmatic, but still, it's been a long, long time since I had bronchitis. And last week and well, the early part of this week, flat on my back, not doing well. So I am sufficiently caffeinated. I'm drinking the last of some tea. Mm. So we'll do that to get started, but I'm feeling better. So first things first, I hope you saw my announcement, and I will reiterate my apology. I don't know, maybe it was the fever delirium. Last week, week number 3, I forgot to turn on, the publish button for questions 1 and 2 during the week. Somebody pointed that out to me on the weekend, saying, "Hey, we can't see the questions." I'm like, "Oh, that's interesting." So if you haven't had time to get to them, I'll give you till Wednesday. We will discuss them in today's video, but spoiler alert. But again, that was my fault. If you were looking for them and they weren't there, that was completely me, and you did nothing wrong. Okay, let's take a look at what we're going to do this week, and then we'll talk about the questions and discuss some of the material from last week. This week, we're going to take a deep dive into the role of international organizations, in helping some countries get the message out. So we're looking at the McPhail-Phipps text again, and that's sort of our main text if you hadn't picked up on that already. And you'll read section 3. All right, there's going to be in this section more than you may have ever suspected you could know about UNESCO. I've worked for UNESCO, or subcontractors that work for UNESCO on projects, but an influential UN agency. And so I have the standard 3 questions about what is it, how does it work, and then I by way of communication in a global environment, if we weren't at least aware of the rapidly changing global environment that we find ourselves in, with the new executive branch that is under President Trump, and the congressional branch under the Republicans, we won't be doing our jobs. Now, again, remember, you've got to develop this sense of professionalism. You can have your opinions, and be they grounded in professional or personal or political, about a political party or a political persona and what they're doing in office. That's fine. Make sure that they're informed opinions, whatever they are. But when it comes to analysis, keep your focus on analysis. Be an evaluator, not an advocator as a researcher. And I'll tell you, if you learn how to do good, solid, impartial, evaluatory research, you can become a better advocate, because then for whatever organization or cause that you are working for, your positions, the evidence that you bring to bear to the argument, will be less assailable than those that are not well grounded in good research. Okay, so one of the questions I asked you to take a look at the current state of UNESCO and United States relationships there too, and to venture an opinion about future relationships, both in terms of making a prediction, and then making your best sort of analytical opinion about what we ought and ought not to be doing. All right, so you'll find that in this week's material. Okay. Second, bit of stuff. You have an assignment due the 7th. That is at the end of this week. This is your first class presentation. And if you look on the syllabus, it'll say presentations this week. That means you're giving them to me. All right. And I see that, from looking in Canvas, that a number of you have done them already. If you have not completed it yet, you still have to the end of the week. And this is an easy one. Okay, this first one. After I finish taking a look at them next week, I'll set up the parameters for your second presentation. Now, some of you have said, well, could we have all 4 presentations, right now? We could start working on them in different orders. No, and here's why. I often look at how well a class does or doesn't do with a given presentation, 1, 2, 3, or 4, and I'll make adjustments to the next assignment. So if I see that you're really strong in some areas, then I don't emphasize those areas for the next assignments. Or if I see that in some areas that you could use some more focus and work, then I emphasize those areas. Does that make sense? Okay. So it's not like I'm trying to guard these as secrets. I'm conducting the class, although it's asynchronous. You can be watching this video, I don't know when. I'm trying to conduct the class in such a way that it evolves and develops, not just semester by semester, but week by week, keeping connected to what you're doing well, where you need work, as well as events that are going on around us. And if I simply lay out all the material, then I have to go back and go, oh no, wait, I know assignment number 4 said, or whatever it is, but we're going to change it to I'm not going to do that. Okay. All right. Let's take a look at last week. I'm going to go through all the questions, even 1 and 2, although I forgot to push the publish button. Again, my apologies. And let's see what you said, and let's see what we can add to it. Okay. According to McPhill and Phipps, what is developmental journalism? What's its purpose? Is it needed? Include a link to support your answer. Charles, you went last. Let's take you first. Good afternoon, everyone. Charles writes. I like that, Charles. According to the authors, developmental journalism is a theoretical counterweight to electronic colonialism that promotes indigenous media in the face of a deluge of media from developed states. Exactly. In other words, we're developing reporting and reporting processes and reporting structures indigenous to certain countries. The author states that 90% of the news agencies are Western and based in core states, and as a result, they inhibit less developed countries' media growth and impose a Western focus on foreign social cultural norms or on indigenous media. However, according to this theory, the method to combat electronic colonialism is to maintain close control of the media by the government, and is a favorite of authoritarian regimes, which is true, which, takes us back to last week when we talked about electronic colonialism. Good answer, Charles. Because, it's which side of the coin are you looking at? Are you looking at the side of, well, countries have a right to pursue their own cultural norms, and it's sort of like Prime Directive for those Star Trek fans, and we ought not to be interfering with it? Or the other side of the coin is that there are universal human rights like education, freedom from unnecessary torture and cruel punishment, economic freedoms. And you can have those as values, either set. The way to enforce the one, that is, we shouldn't be imposing these on other countries, is to do nothing. The way to see to the other demands, in some instances, that you disrupt cultural norms, like last week when we talked about genital mutilation. Okay. And this is a hotly debated topic, that is the balance between the two, even today. All right. Because it is true in most places in the world, the system of government is, number one, not democratic and And what I mean by that is even representative not Republican, sorry. It's not democratic at all. In fact, there's countries in Europe that still have monarchs, and I don't just mean England. Okay. And two, not representative in a universal suffrage way at all in terms of participation, even in an oligarchical government. That is, so you have monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy. And oligarchy is ruled by a powerful few. And most countries fall, there are few countries today that fall into the strict monarch / dictatorship as actual functional entities. I mean, you have cooperative, sort of symbolic, what on paper says constitutional monarch, like say Great Britain. Most countries are oligarchical, and including, some argue, the United States. And that is, it's ruled by a group of people that come from a specific class that they tend to sort of recycle themselves, and they maintain power. Okay. They're not open to free flow of communication, and if it suits them quite well to have certain types of media in, many, and China could be fairly described as an oligarchy. That is, the Communist Party rules as an oligarchy. They're quite happy to have a string of U.S. films enter China, so long as they don't touch on subjects that the Communist Party doesn't want discussed. And so the trade-off is the Communist Party says to their people, well, see here, we're giving you all kinds of media choices, while at the same time closing down what it is that they actually see as a choice. Do you disrupt that? Or do you say, well, that's indigenous media? Back to you, Charles. In his article, Developmental Journalism, Gender Sensitivity and Sustainability in Egypt, Analyzing Women's Voice Perspective, Rashid researches the impact of government control limiting the effects of Deutsche Welle Academy, work with female journalists. The author describes the current environment and history of journalism under authoritarian Egyptian governments since Nasser. The project was designed to improve skills of female journalists, empower them in society, and gain employment. The author found that prospective journalists often could not get jobs due to government restrictions and found other employments outside of the field. However, the ones that remained in journalism played a transformative role in creating a more accepting environment in Egypt's society for female journalists. As development journalism, this paper describes the efforts to build an indigenous journalistic capacity, albeit by a foreign NGO, which brings us back full circle. Yeah. The other significant component to this equation is sometimes the unintended effects of whether it's NGO or USAID or DOD, Department of Defense. DOD sponsors a lot of international activities that don't have anything to do with defense. There has been this focus on gender and diversity, equity, and inclusion, which is now getting some very, very stiff pushback. One of the unintended effects has been the reaction of the indigenous societies. We tend, as Westerners, to look through the lens of, well, of course. And I actually worked in Egypt with a group of journalists, Christian journalists, trying to help them develop a stronger and more steady voice, a Christian channel. It didn't work, but I was in Cairo for a while. But anyway, we tend to look through this lens that, of course, they want more female journalists. And it sometimes happens, and Afghanistan is a case in point, and I work very closely with U.S. efforts from Afghanistan, particularly the American University of Afghanistan. I was interim chief of staff for the university. The women in the country don't want women journalists. And then we're back to the two sides of the coin. Can you flip a coin in such a way that both sides are represented in a equilibrium, a balance? I mean, if you spin it on the table, you can say, yeah, but in terms of society, no, you can't. You can't. And I can't say that this was the factor, but I can tell you that one of the factors that the populace embraced the Taliban as rapidly as they did, and there were a lot of reasons for why the Afghan government fell. Okay. But one of the reasons that the Taliban regained popularity within the citizenry is they were very unhappy with US sponsored programs coming into Afghanistan, disrupting traditional gender norms. And the discontent was found among women as well as among men. And we don't do ourselves any favor. And this is not saying, and this is in no way saying, let me clarify this before what I say what I'm going to say. This is no way saying that women in Afghanistan should stay indoors and never show their face and not be on TV and have no jobs. Nope. That's not the point. But we don't do ourselves any favors as scholars and as a people at large when we distort our own history on these matters. So, for example, it's a common trope. In fact, it's so common, it's just not even questioned, that during the suffrage movement in the United States leading up to the 19th Amendment, throughout the 1919s, before it was passed in 1920, that this was, among women, this was just a given. They all wanted the vote, and the reason that they didn't get it was that men didn't want them to have it. Okay? That's just a universal trope. I challenge people, and again, this is not calling universal suffrage into question. This is clarifying how it is to get from one place to another with a population. I challenge people to look at the documents. Look at the documents by the suffragettes. Look at the opinion polls published among women by women concerning their attitudes about universal suffrage. And there was not a sweeping majority of support. In fact, in some polls, it was just the opposite. There were women that did not want universal suffrage. Now, you might say, well, why is that? Or, we tend to project back explanations like, well, they were being oppressed by the male society and their husbands. And okay. Again, we're not doing ourselves any favors in understanding the cultural context within which these events happen. And as such, we tend to, get this bias that we project ahead and we want to confirm when we're dealing with cultures abroad. Women in the early 1900s knew that suffrage, that is voting, came along with obligations to serve and be serviced by the United States government, a number of which they didn't want. And in fact, there's still, a significant carve out today. we don't have a draft anymore. We don't call it the draft. We call it something more PR friendly, selective service, which I guess in the case of a national military emergency, the government says, well, I select you and now you go serve. So, okay. Excuse me. There's some truth in the advertising. There's all men of the age 18 to 45 are required to register for the draft. Women are not. Go back and read the documents. And you'll find there were suffragettes going, yeah, no, or there are women going, yeah, no. So we're not doing ourselves any favors by developing these preconceived notions about what it is and why it is that various cultures want. Now, that again, that does not necessarily solve the problem of the very, very intractable duality of encountering culture and then injecting by whatever however you want to call it, injecting values into the culture not indigenous to the culture, like female reporters in Egypt. Okay, question number 2. Consider Rostow's stages of economic growth. What, if anything, do they have to do with a country developing an independent media voice, one that speaks to its own people about its own issues? Billy, you went last here. Let's take you first. McPhill and Phipps discussed the problem of illiteracy in peripheral areas. There are a few problems with this and the use of media. We must consider the culture not only as cultural of illiterates, but why the culture chose to remain that way, or if external reasons caused it. If a culture chooses to remain illiterate, they have no use for any kind of media, writing, or need to conform to the norms and rules that come with literacy. We must dig deeper, sorry, my mistake, not yours, to discover the reasons a culture is predominantly illiterate. If we find that a country does not accept cultivating an independent media voice among the population, what do? Rostow's model of stages of economic growth assumes that if a nation or group would just listen and learn, economic growth would occur, which I think, as some of you point out, is a very Western perspective in and of itself. The problem anticipated by Rostow's model failed to comprehend the size of the problem. If a culture decides, for whatever reason, to introduce the concept to illiterate people, depending on what age of life they're in, could make life better for them as individuals, or for whatever reason they chose to decline. These decisions are based on so many factors, including generational values, experience, tradition, religious beliefs, et cetera, et cetera. Exactly. Benjamin, let's take a look at you. Rostow's economic stage development model assumes that development is equated with economic growth. Economic growth is intrinsically tied to mass media consumption, much of which is imported media consumption. So, when answering the question regarding what sort of model has to do with countries developing own media voice, it appears to me that creating an independent media voice localized in the country isn't seen as core need for the first 3 phases of the 5-phase model. However, once a nation reaches phase 4, drive to maturity, and particularly phase 5, the age of mass consumption, the addition of independent media voices would naturally involve mass media environments. Okay, yes, good and good. All right, question number 4. So these I did post, okay? I did remember, but I mean, question number 3, not question number 4, I'm sorry. I did remember to push the button. Okay. Why, according to McPhill and Phipps, is Rostow's economic model inadequate? Charles, you did last. Let's take you first. Rostow developed a linear economic growth model that proceeds in 5 stages: traditional society, the establishment of preconditions, takeoff to situated growth, strive to maturity, and finally the age of mass consumption. Each stage builds on a previous one, expanding the economy and benefiting society. However, Phil and Phipps propose that this economic growth model is inadequate for 3 reasons. Number 1, organic growth is inhibited by international assistance. Illiteracy